Hello there, and welcome to Amiga Reviews with me, the eager Amiga Eagle, never knowingly undersold. In this episode, I'm going to be looking at Hunter, one of the first fully 3D free-roaming games for the Amiga, and the possibility that it might just be the granddaddy of Grand Theft Auto 3. For most people, the time when games really started to make the glorious jump from 2D to 3D was around the dawn of the Sega Saturn, the original Sony PlayStation, and the Nintendo Ultra 64. This is when 3D games really started to hit the mainstream. In the previous console generation, most games were 2D sprite affairs, apart from one or two notable exceptions. However, for owners of computers such as the Amiga, Atari ST and PC, 3D games were already becoming a mainstay. Games such as Wolfenstein 3D were paving the way for the games that we know and love today, developing into titles such as Doom, Quake and Grand Theft Auto. There were few gamers from that time who do not remember the astonishing spectacle of being able to move in any direction, running, walking, strafing and swimming through lavish landscapes which were unlike anything else for the consoles at the time. But for those early adopters, they had been able to experience full 3D games long before those supposedly pioneering titles. Back in 1990, a programmer named Paul Holmes was developing a fractal geometry game that was set to be released by a small company called CRL Group. However, they folded before the game saw completion, effectively cancelling the game. Later picked up by Activision, the game was substantially rewritten, using the original game's code as a foundation for the new project. After a few delays, Hunter was released for the Amiga and Atari ST in 1991, 2 years before the likes of Star Fox and 10 years before Grand Theft Auto 3. I jump ahead so far because GTA 3 was praised as being one of the first 3D sandbox game where the player was able to go virtually anywhere they wanted, drive any vehicle, complete numerous missions however they saw fit, and utilise a plethora of weapons and tools. However, Hunter was doing this a whole decade beforehand. In Hunter, you play a soldier in an enormous 3D environment, well at least enormous back then, who is tasked with undertaking various missions, from destroying random targets to assassinating the general of an opposing faction. You start at your headquarters where you will receive your instructions and coordinates of the target, and it's up to you to arm yourself accordingly and get the job done by any means necessary. The gameplay is very similar to what we've come to expect from open world games today, albeit much more fundamental in its execution. You can move in the usual 8 directions due to the standard controller layout for as far as the limits of the environment would allow. The player is unable to utilise the mouse for movement, as this is used to navigate maps and menus. Another of the main drawbacks is that the camera is constantly facing north, and this cannot be altered. You can zoom in and out a little, but whenever you have to travel south, you are basically moving directly towards the camera almost suicidally, and there is very little way, apart from the optional radar, to know what is coming at you. There is also considerable lag from the controller input before the character reacts. To begin with, this can be very frustrating, and a certain amount of adjustment is required. The effect of this can be slightly lessened if you have more powerful hardware than the basic Amiga, or when there is less on screen. But if there are vehicles, buildings, enemies or animals on screen, then the slowdown is very noticeable. Displaying the map can also add to the slowdown, and for a game running at 12 frames per second or less, this can be positively pedestrian. No pun intended. Very typical of 3D games from this era, the graphics are extremely basic. Compared to the lavish scenery, intricate detail and huge maps we are used to today, Hunter is very limited in its visual appeal. The buildings are angular, the vehicles are boxy, and the landscape would even be disapproving of those who play Minecraft. The water is one shade of blue, and half the time I wonder if the main character's limbs are even attached. All of the graphics are 3D vector polygons, with no shading, no texture mapping, nothing. Everything from the designs on the flags to the writing on the buildings has been created using vector graphics. Around this time, other 3D games started to pop up, such as Microprose Formula 1 Grand Prix, Stunt Car Racer and Trex Warrior, which would build on the 3D capabilities of the Amiga. Interestingly though, When you compare this to later 3D releases such as Alien Breed 3D and Gloom, Hunter looks much cleaner and more presentable. Back when Quake boasted that it was fully 3D compared to the likes of Doom, Hunter was doing that 5 years previously. But I think you have to go into it with the mindset of a few decades ago, and then you realise that this is actually quite a feat. A lot of people like to say that graphics don't make a game, but even if this is the case, I personally think that they certainly contribute highly to the aesthetics of the game. Let me put it this way. Grand Theft Auto 3 required 500 meg of hard drive space. GTA 5 is 95 gig. Hunter? The whole game fits on a single density 720 kilobyte floppy disk with room to spare for save games. 3.5 inch discs are not even big enough to fit a single photo on these days. Despite this, there are still impressive little effects, such as the gradual passage of time. During the darkness, you can light up the area with a flare, which has a nice touch seeing as the sky and the water stay dark. One thing that I definitely find funny is that in most 3D sandbox games, people complain about invisible walls and the like. Well, Hunter has a white frame around the limits of the map, and if you travel to these extremes, you will bump into an impassable white line. It's not very subtle, but this gives the feeling that you have quite literally reached the end of the map. The play area is of a considerable size, even by today's standards. It is possible to travel from one end of the map to the other in a few minutes by helicopter, but there is plenty to explore. Even 30 years later, I am still finding places that I have never seen. There are also 3 different maps depending on the type of mission that you choose. I have been told that the maps are randomly generated, but I don't believe this is the case. However, 3 full maps is still a lot to explore. The characters in the game are not one of its strongest points. The main protagonist doesn't even have a face, if you don't include the James Garner lookalike on the status screen, that is. The highest amount of enemies that I've encountered on screen at any one time is 2. The enemy AI is also not very smart. They will chase you on foot or in vehicles, but as soon as you don an enemy uniform, which only changes the top half of your character to red, they will stop firing and walk away. They will even happily ask you what your mission is if you talk to them after this. There are actually a considerable amount of vehicles that you can commandeer in the game. Cars, vans, tanks, helicopters, bicycles, boats, and even a windsurfing board. These are littered around the various islands, and providing they are not currently occupied by an enemy soldier, they are all fair game. Walking and swimming are very slow and considerably dangerous methods of moving around, so if you find yourself without a vehicle, you better procure one pretty damn fast. Buildings also pop up frequently here and there, and while you are not likely to happen across anything more than a few houses in one place, you can enter virtually every building, whether you need to or not. Apart from the main allied buildings, virtually everything can be destroyed too. Even in the modern age, there are not many open world games that allow you that kind of access. Music in the game is virtually non-existent. Apart from the rather morose main theme tune and a few others for concluding the missions, there is no in-game music at all. Sound effects are limited to things like gunshots, vehicle sounds, explosions, seagulls, and occasional environmental noise. However, there are different sounds for different vehicles, and when you hear a missile launching, unless you've launched it, it is a truly disconcerting sound that has you desperately scanning the area to see where it is coming from. There is not much to write home about here, but again, one 3.5 inch disc, people. Moving around is a clunky affair, mostly due to the lacklustre frame rate, but there's also a great deal of lag, especially if you're firing a weapon repeatedly. In this time of 120 frames per second, you can almost feel your life slipping away when you play Hunter. It is possible to get the game running slightly more smoothly on more powerful Amigas, but I don't have one of those, and it doesn't make that much difference anyway. I have been told that the Atari ST version runs a bit faster due to the fact that everything in the Amiga has to be rendered in software, but I don't have an ST either. Hunter truly is a sandbox game, because it's totally up to you where you go and how you complete the missions. The only restriction is time, and boy, time limits can be quite tight considering that you are going to be spending a lot of it walking after your vehicle inevitably runs out of fuel or is destroyed by enemy fire. An interesting feature is that the game does not end when the time limit is up. that only happens when you enter your base in a tardy fashion. You are still free to roam after your deadline, and in some cases you just get to enjoy the landscape knowing that there is very little point in returning home. To sum up, Hunter is really showing its age, but back then it was one of the pioneering games when it came to 3D. Despite the fact that it has numerous glitches, lacks any real sound or music, and is slow and clunky by today's standards, it received very positive reviews and critical reception. I didn't know many people that owned Hunter, but most will concede that once you started playing it, it was hard to stop and the hours would melt away very quickly. It is one of those games that is remembered very fondly by those who played it, and many games that thousands play today owe their very existence to these epoch-making games of yesteryear. Thanks for watching. I'm the eager Amiga Eagle. See you next game.